What happens when one of Britain's most beloved actors walks onto a daytime talk show expecting a friendly chat about his latest film, only to be blindsided by a host who seems determined to turn a simple interview into a public interrogation? In just 30 seconds, a harmless question about his personal life spirals into one of the most uncomfortable moments in television history, and what follows is a clash so intense that it ends with security being called and a guest storming off set in front of millions of viewers. Hugh Grant arrived at the Loose Women's studio that morning in good spirits. He was there to promote his new movie, shake a few hands, share some laughs, and get back to his day. The audience was buzzing with excitement. After all, this was Hugh Grant, the charming leading man who had stolen hearts in countless romantic comedies. The panel consisted of Denise Welch, who was leading the interview, along with Nadia Sawalha, Kay Adams, and Jane Moore. The stage was set, the cameras were rolling, and everything seemed perfectly normal. The interview started off pleasant enough. Denise welcomed Hugh with a big smile, and he settled into the famous purple couch, looking relaxed in his navy blazer and crisp white shirt. The first few minutes were filled with the usual banter. They talked about the weather, about how long it had been since he had last been on the show, about his journey to the studio that morning. Hugh was his typical self, witty and engaging, making the audience laugh with his self-deprecating humor. Then Denise shifted gears. "So, Hugh," she said, leaning forward with a look that seemed a bit too intense for a casual chat, "let's talk about your reputation. You've had quite the journey in the public eye, haven't you?" Hugh's smile faltered just slightly, but he maintained his composure. "Well, I suppose we all have our moments, don't we? That's life." "Moments," Denise repeated, her voice taking on an edge. "That's one way to but you've had more than just moments, haven't you? I mean, we all remember the scandal, the arrests, the very public mistakes." The other panelists shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Nadia glanced at Kay with a concerned expression. This wasn't the playful teasing that usually characterized Loose Women interviews. This felt different. This felt personal. Hugh cleared his throat. "I think we've all moved past that, haven't we? That was a very long time ago, and I've been quite open about my regrets. I came here today to talk about my film, actually." But Denise wasn't done. She pressed on, ignoring his attempt to redirect the conversation. "Moved past it? I'm not sure the public has moved past it, Hugh. I mean, you built your entire career on being the lovable, bumbling romantic lead, and then you go and do something like that. Don't you think that's hypocritical?" The studio audience fell silent. You could hear the tension crackling through the air. Hugh's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "I don't think it's hypocritical to be a flawed human being. No, I think it would be hypocritical to pretend I'm perfect when I'm clearly not." Which I've never done, by the way. Jane Moore jumped in, clearly trying to ease the tension. "I think what Hugh is saying is that we all make mistakes, and he's been very accountable for his. Perhaps we can talk about the film now? I've heard wonderful things about it." But Denise cut her off. "No, Jane, I think this is important. Hugh comes on our show, expects us to just promote his movie, but he doesn't want to address the elephant in the room. The fact is, Hugh, you've spent years playing characters that women fall in love with, and then you treat women in your real life with what many would call disrespect. How do you square that?" Hugh's expression hardened. The affable charm that usually defined his public appearances was evaporating. "I'm sorry, but I find that incredibly offensive. You don't know anything about how I treat women in my real life. You're basing your entire judgment on tabloid stories and one very public mistake that I made decades ago." "One mistake?" Denise shot back. "There have been multiple stories about your behavior, your attitude toward relationships, your commitment issues. And now you want us to just ignore all of that and talk about your movie like nothing happened?" Kay Adams tried to intervene. "Denise, I think maybe we should—" "No, Kay," Hugh interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "Let her finish. I want to hear exactly what Denise thinks she knows about my private life." The audience was completely still now. This had gone far beyond an awkward interview. This was a confrontation, and everyone in the studio could feel it. Denise sat back in her chair, arms crossed, a look of satisfaction on her face as if she had successfully cornered him. "I think what everyone knows, Hugh, is that you've made a career out of playing the nice guy while behaving like anything but in your personal life. And I think it's fair to call that out." "Fair to call that out," Hugh repeated slowly, his British accent becoming more pronounced as his anger grew. You think it's fair to invite someone onto your show under the pretense of promoting their work and then ambush them with personal attacks based on gossip and speculation? That's your definition of fair? Nadia spoke up, her voice gentle but firm. Hugh, I don't think Denise meant it as an attack. We talk about everything on this show, including difficult topics. Hugh turned to her, his expression softening slightly. Nadia, with respect, there's a difference between discussing difficult topics and launching a character assassination. I've been nothing but polite since I arrived. I answered questions about my past honestly, but what Denise is doing right now isn't journalism, and it isn't entertainment. It's just mean. Mean? Denise laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound. Oh, come on. Hugh, you can't handle a few tough questions? You're a public figure. You've been in this industry for how many years? And you're going to sit there and cry about a few tough questions? I'm not crying about anything, Hugh said, his voice low and controlled. But I'm questioning why you seem to have such a personal vendetta. Did I offend you somehow? Did I do something to you specifically that would warrant this level of hostility? This isn't about me, Denise snapped. This is about accountability. This is about not letting celebrities waltz onto our show and expect us to fawn over them without addressing the real issues. Hugh leaned forward, his eyes locked on Denise. The real issues? The real issue here is that you've decided to use your platform to bully a guest instead of having a professional conversation. And frankly, it says far more about you than it does about me. The other panelists exchanged glances. Jane Moore looked like she wanted to crawl under the desk. Kay Adams was shaking her head slightly, clearly disapproving of how this had spiraled. Nadia was biting her lip, looking between Hugh and Denise with obvious concern. Denise's face flushed red. Bully? You're calling me a bully? That's rich coming from someone with your history. My history, Hugh said, his voice rising now, is mine to carry. And I've been open about my mistakes. I've apologized. I've tried to be better. But what you're doing right now is not holding me accountable. You're trying to humiliate me on live television, and I'm not going to sit here and let you do it. The audience was completely transfixed. Some people had their hands over their mouths. Others were leaning forward in their seats, unable to look away from the car crash unfolding before them. Denise stood up from her chair, pointing a finger at Hugh. If you can't handle the heat, Hugh, then maybe you shouldn't have come on the show. We have every right to ask you whatever questions we want. Hugh stood up as well, towering over the desk that separated them. You have the right to ask questions, yes, but I have the right to be treated with basic respect. And what you've shown me today is nothing but contempt. Kay tried one more time to restore order. Okay, everyone, let's just take a breath here. We're all professionals. Let's sit down and no, Hugh said firmly. I'm not sitting back down. I'm done with this interview. I came here in good faith and I've been treated appallingly. Denise, I don't know what your problem is, but I'm not going to be your punching bag. Denise laughed again, that same sharp, mocking sound. Oh, here we go. The big star can't handle a little criticism, so he's going to storm off. How very mature of you, Hugh. Criticism? Hugh's voice was incredulous now. Is that what you call this? You've spent the last 15 minutes attacking my character, making assumptions about my personal life, and dismissing every attempt I've made to redirect this conversation to something productive. That's not criticism, Denise. That's harassment. Jane Moore finally found her voice, speaking firmly. Denise, I think Hugh has a point. This has gone too far. But Denise ignored her colleague completely, keeping her focus on Hugh. You know what I think, Hugh? I think you're so used to everyone kissing your feet because you're a movie star that you can't handle it when someone actually challenges you. You're spoiled, entitled, and you can't stand that someone isn't falling all over themselves to worship you. The irony of her statement wasn't lost on anyone. Here was Denise Welch, accusing Hugh Grant of being entitled and unable to handle criticism, when she had spent the entire interview demonstrating those exact qualities herself. Hugh took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was calm, but filled with barely contained fury. I'm going to say this once, and then I'm leaving. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about. You've constructed this entire narrative in your head about who I am based on tabloid headlines and your own prejudices. You haven't asked me a single genuine question about my work, my craft, or anything of substance. You invited me here to tear me down, pure and simple. And the saddest part is that you seem to think this makes you a good interviewer. It doesn't. It makes you cruel. Nadia had tears in her eyes now. Hugh, please, let's just... But... Hugh was already removing his microphone, his hands steady despite the obvious emotion in his voice. Nadia, you seem lovely. Jane, Kay, thank you for trying to intervene. But I will not sit here and be verbally abused by someone who clearly has her own issues to work through. Denise's face was now a deep shade of crimson. How dare you? How dare you come on my show and speak to me like that? Your show? Hugh said, raising an eyebrow. Last I checked, this was a panel show with 4 hosts, not the Denise Welch Hour. Though based on today's performance, perhaps that's what you think it is. He placed the microphone carefully on the coffee table and began to walk off the set. The cameras followed him, capturing every moment. The audience sat in stunned silence, not sure whether to applaud or gasp. Denise called after him, her voice shrill now. Fine, walk off. Run away. That's what you do, isn't it, Hugh? When things get difficult, you run. Hugh stopped, turned back to face her one last time, and said with devastating calm, No, Denise, when things get difficult, I face them. But when someone is being deliberately cruel and unprofessional, I remove myself from the situation. There's a difference. Perhaps you'll learn that someday. And with that, he walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of shocked faces and a host who had just experienced one of the most spectacular backfires in talk show history. The remaining panelists sat in uncomfortable silence for a moment. Jane Moore was the first to speak, her voice quiet but firm. Well, that was absolutely awful. Kay Adams nodded in agreement. I've never seen anything like that. Denise, what were you thinking? But Denise was still standing, still fuming, unwilling to admit that she had pushed things too far. He was being oversensitive. We ask tough questions on this show. That's what we do. Nadia shook her head, wiping her eyes. Those weren't tough questions, Denise. That was an attack. And you know it. In the audience, people were whispering to each other, processing what they had just witnessed. Some were clearly on Hugh's side, shaking their heads at how he had been treated. Others looked confused, unsure of what had just happened, but everyone agreed on one thing. They had just watched something unprecedented. Backstage, Hugh was met by his publicist, who looked absolutely mortified. Hugh, I am so sorry. I had no idea she was going to go after you like that. Hugh waved off the apology. It's not your fault. You couldn't have known, but I wanted on record that I gave that interview in good faith and was treated abominably. His publicist nodded frantically. Absolutely. We'll release a statement. This is unacceptable. Meanwhile, back on set, the producers were scrambling. This was live television, and they had just lost their main guest in the most dramatic fashion possible. The remaining panelists tried to regroup, but the energy was completely shattered. How do you move on from something like that? How do you pretend everything is fine when your colleague has just driven away one of Britain's most beloved actors? Denise tried to compose herself, smoothing down her hair and taking a sip of water. But even she seemed to realize that something had gone very wrong. The confidence she had displayed during the confrontation was starting to crack, replaced by a creeping awareness that she might have miscalculated. Kay Adams addressed the camera, her voice professional but strained. Well, that was certainly not how we expected this interview to go. We'll take a quick break and be right back. As soon as they cut to commercial, chaos erupted. Producers rushed onto the set. The other panelists turned on Denise, their voices raised in anger and disbelief. Even the audience members who could hear the commotion from their seats were talking amongst themselves, some defending Hugh, others trying to understand what they had just witnessed. One audience member, an elderly woman in the third row, spoke to her friend in a voice loud enough for those around her to hear. I've watched this show for years, and I've never seen anything so rude in my life. That poor man came here to talk about his film, and she just tore into him. Absolutely disgraceful. Her friend nodded vigorously. I used to like Denise, but that was bullying, plain and simple. He had every right to walk off. The makeup artist who had been touching up the panelists during commercial breaks stood in the wings, shaking her head. She had worked on hundreds of episodes of Loose Women and had never seen anything like this. Guests got into disagreements sometimes. Sure, things got heated occasionally, but this was different. This was personal, and it was ugly. Back in the studio, Denise was trying to defend herself to her fellow panelists, but they weren't having it. You crossed a line, Jane said firmly. Multiple lines, actually. We're supposed to make our guests feel welcome, not attack them the moment they sit down. I wasn't attacking him, Denise insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. I was asking legitimate questions about his past. "There's a way to do that," Kay interjected. "And that wasn't it. You went for him, Denise. You wanted to make him uncomfortable, and you succeeded. But at what cost?" Nadia was quieter, but her disappointment was evident. "He called you cruel, and honestly, Denise, watching what just happened, I can't say he was wrong." The stage manager called out that they were back in 30 seconds. The panelists quickly moved back to their positions, trying to compose themselves. But the damage was done. The rest of the show was awkward and stilted. They tried to move on to other topics, but everyone was still processing what had happened. The energy never recovered. In the green room, other scheduled guests for the show were watching monitors in disbelief. One actress who was supposed to appear in the next segment turned to the producer. "Am I still expected to go out there after that?" The producer looked exhausted. "We're working on it. Just give us a few minutes." Word was spreading quickly beyond the studio. Social media was already exploding with reactions from viewers who had watched the disaster unfold live. Hashtags were trending, think pieces were being written in real time. And the consensus was clear. Hugh Grant had been ambushed, and he had handled it with remarkable restraint, given the circumstances. One viewer tweeted, "Just watch Hugh Grant walk off loose women, and I don't blame him one bit." Denise Welch was absolutely out of line. "That wasn't an interview. That was a hit job." Another wrote, "I've lost all respect for Denise Welch after watching her attack Hugh Grant for no reason. He was nothing but polite and professional, and she treated him like garbage. Shame on her." The tweets kept coming, thousands of them, most supporting Hugh and criticizing Denise's behavior. A few tried to defend her, arguing that celebrities need to be held accountable, but even those defenses rang hollow given how the interview had played out. Back at the studio, Hugh was preparing to leave the building. His publicist was on the phone, doing damage control, scheduling interviews to give Hugh's side of the story. But honestly, Hugh didn't think he needed much defending. Anyone who had watched that interview could see exactly what had happened. As he walked toward the exit, several crew members approached him, apologizing for what had happened. A cameraman shook his hand. "I've worked on this show for 5 years, and I've never been more embarrassed. You handled that with real class, Mr. Grant." Hugh thanked him sincerely. "I appreciate that. And please know that I have no ill will toward anyone here except for the person who decided to use me as target practice." The security guard at the front desk gave him a sympathetic nod. "Saw the whole thing on the monitor, sir? You didn't deserve that." Hugh managed a tired smile. "No, I didn't. But I suppose these things happen." Outside, photographers were already gathering, having heard about the dramatic walkout. Hugh's car pulled up, and he climbed in quickly, not wanting to give them the satisfaction of a photo of him looking upset or angry. He wanted to maintain his dignity, even in this moment of absurdity. As the car pulled away from the studio, Hugh looked out the window and allowed himself a bare moment of reflection. He had been in the public eye for decades. He had weathered scandals, criticism, and intense scrutiny. But what had happened in that studio was something different. It wasn't accountability or tough journalism. It was simply someone using their position of power to be needlessly cruel, and then being shocked when their target refused to play along. Inside the studio, the show was wrapping up. The final segment was mercifully short, and the panelists signed off with forced smiles. As soon as the camera stopped rolling, Denise stood up and walked off the set without speaking to anyone. She knew, even if she wouldn't admit it, that she had made a terrible mistake. The audience filed out, still buzzing with shock and excitement. They had come expecting a light, fun morning show, and instead they had witnessed one of the most dramatic moments in daytime television history. Some were thrilled by the spectacle. Others felt genuinely sorry for Hugh Grant. But everyone agreed they had just seen something they would never forget. The producers convened in an emergency meeting. There would be consequences, discussions about editorial standards, debates about how to handle the fallout, but all of that would come later. Right now, they had to figure out how to address what had just happened in front of millions of viewers. One producer, a woman who had been with the show since its inception, summed it up perfectly. "We invited a respected actor onto our show to promote his film. Instead, we humiliated him for no good reason. Whatever happens next, we deserve it." The story of what happened that day would be told and retold for years to come. It would be analyzed, debated, and referenced whenever discussions about interview ethics came up. And through it all, one thing remained clear. Hugh Grant had walked onto that set as a guest in good faith, and he had been treated with shocking disrespect. His decision to remove himself from that toxic situation wasn't an act of cowardice or oversensitivity. It was an act of self-preservation and dignity. He had drawn a line and said, quite simply, that he would not tolerate being treated that way, regardless of who was doing it or what platform they had. And in doing so, he had shown more grace and professionalism than the person who was supposed to be hosting him.